I'm John Batchelor. This is the John Batchelor Show. Claudia Rosette, writing most recently at Pajamas Media. Claudia's with the Foundation for the Defense of Democracies, where she's an investigative reporter, looking at the three acts for Vladimir Putin's success this last week, starting with the General Assembly speech and meeting with the president earlier in the week, and then leading into the 1, 2, 3 waves of attacks by Russian high-performance aircraft against the al-Nusra, al-Qaeda units in western Syria, against the Free Syrian Army units associated with the United States and our allies Turkey and Qatar, and also against ISIS at some point in these hours. Claudia, very good evening to you. The President of the United States, Barack Obama, giving a late-in-the-week press conference, says that Mr. Putin went into Syria out of weakness, that Mr. Putin doesn't have the world with him. Let's review the week and not ask how the president came to this conclusion. Ask everybody what they believe is going on right now in Syria. You begin with Act 1, Monday, September 28th, in the United Nations General Assembly. Mr. Obama stands up and delivers a speech. And following that, Mr. Putin delivers a speech. How did Act 1 go, Claudia? Who won this one? Good evening to you.
Good evening, John. Act 1 is President Obama, whose engagement, empowerment of a parade of dictators, Russia, China, Iran, Cuba, has reduced him to the opening act at the UN General Assembly when they speak. Stood up and gave a speech. It was actually hard to follow in places because it made no real sense, but saying that we must not look back at history. We must all sort of once again rise together and everything will be great. President Putin got up and gave us, and P.S., Obama thinks that President Assad in Syria must go, as President Obama has been saying for the past 4 years, although Assad is still there. President Putin got up, gave his own review of history and said Assad must stay. And that was Act 1. Though, John, we must mention that Putin had already had a plan, clearly. Things were about to happen like a thunderclap, which apparently President Obama in no way had taken into account.
I want to interpret the way Vladimir Putin presented himself to the United Nations and ask your pair of eyes on this. It looked to me like the president of Russia, in translation, I'm reading his document, was telling the General Assembly and the television audience what he was going to do. Here's what I'm going to do. Here's how I'm going to do it. You can join me or get out of the way. That's how I heard it. Did you hear it differently, Claudia?
No, you are precisely right. And look, President Putin does not usually come to the general debate of the General Assembly, which is a long series of speeches by from every country on the planet. He usually has his foreign minister speak. This year, he came. Now, the sort of immediate reason was it's the 70th anniversary of the UN. But I don't think he came to celebrate that. He came to tell the world that Assad must stay in Syria. And what we now know is he was about to act on that speech. And
President Obama's speech, Syria, Assad must go, Ukraine, Russia must go. And by the way, we'll all work together and Russia's going to look to its best interest to follow my direction. I understand the president was a little more long-winded than that, but that would be the message to Putin in particular. Assad out of Syria, Russia out of Ukraine, and what is best for your people is what I tell you.
Yes, and the Iran nuclear deal will bring us peace and light. This is if wishes were horses, foreign policy.
All right.
And none of it's happening.
Act 2. This is the next day, September 29th, at the United Nations. Mr. Obama convenes a group meeting. He calls it Leaders Summit on Countering ISIL and Violent Extremism. How did it go, Claudia?
A lot of talk, John. This is a lot of people and a lot of talk. They sat there and they talked. They talked so much that President Obama finally turned over the chair to Vice President Biden, and they went on talking. And if anything of great note has come out of that, we certainly haven't seen any sign of it yet. Actually, he began by telling the assembled eminences that a year earlier he had asked them to go home and think of steps they could take to help counter ISIS and what they call we call terrorism, and he calls violent extremism. And so after a year of considering, it was a big talk fest, John. It was a classic UN moment, and this is what the U.S. was leading. Meanwhile, Putin was not at this leaders' summit. He had returned to Moscow.
I note that difference between terrorism and violent extremism. Lavrov uses the term terrorism. Putin uses the term terrorism. China uses the term terrorism, and then they use the term counterterrorism. So at this instance, we could say that language is a barrier. Correct, Claudia?
Correct. As George Orwell said, ill written is ill thought.
In addition to that second act, Mr. Obama is looking for allies. In his press conference at the end of the week, he made note of the fact that he has lots of allies. Is that what we're looking at, the people who attended this meeting? Is that what Mr. Obama counts as American allies?
All of it, John, yes, apparently he does. The trouble with that is it was all useless on the ground when Act 3, on Wednesday, into day 3 of this drama, a Russian 3-star general appeared at the U.S. Embassy in Baghdad with a démarche telling the U.S. that its planes should get out of the way in Syria because Russia was about to conduct airstrikes with the material and personnel it had been moving in there as we were all preparing for the General Assembly. Well, while President Obama was arranging the conference at the UN, President Putin was putting boots and warplanes on the ground in Syria.
And now we're told that some of the targets chosen by the Russians were the Free Syrian Army. The people that we've paid for, supported. And in fact, there was news reporting that these are CIA-trained agents, and the Russians hit them first. They hit their first-rate communications equipment, and they're looking for their TOW missiles. That was the third act. Now, Claudia, your measure of this is going in one direction unless it's stopped. Do you see Russia backing off, or, as the president put it today in the press conference, do you see Russia evidencing weakness at this point?
No, not at all. And Vladimir Putin did not go in there because of great love for Bashar Assad. He went in there because Syria has become the gateway back into the Middle East. Russia is already in cahoots with Iran, and the nuclear deal will help it there. And in Syria, ever since the erasing of the Red Line in 2013, Russia, President Obama at that stage, backed away, deferred to Vladimir Putin, and paved the way into Syria. President Putin is now moving in. And, you know, the Russian military does not stop to read Miranda rights or delicately differentiate the population. I saw when I was working in Russia in the 90s, I can tell you how they dealt with Grozny. They bombed it into rubble. There was just nothing left by the time they were done. And Putin is far less constrained, in other words, by the niceties. And the problem is, no, it's not weakness, because the U.S. has been talking and conducting, we're conducting airstrikes, but in such a way that it is not actually changing the situation. In fact, things have been getting worse. Meanwhile, Putin has now made a definitive move. What you just saw was, while President Obama, for year number 4 of the Syrian conflict, turned up and talked some more, discussed and debated as if it were an academic seminar. Meanwhile, Vladimir Putin arrived Monday at the UN, told the world what he was going to do, basically, went back to Moscow, and by Wednesday morning was doing it.
The curtain comes down on the third act of a drama in the 21st Century World Order. That's the title given to it by Claudia Rosett of the Foundation for the Defense of Democracies. A polite applause from the audience, everybody pouring out for a cigarette and a groan. I'm John Batchelor. This is The John Batchelor Show.